Hello, everybody. It's 1 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Law Enforcement Trauma-Informed Interviews for Sexual Assault Investigations. My name is Ashley Stewart-Griffith, and I work at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And I'm joined here with Jessica Journey, and she works at MNCASA at SVJI. And we are the admin for the webinar. We are here in Minnesota, and we are joined by Justin BOARDMAN, and he is in Utah. So I'm gonna unmute him here, and he's gonna take it away.
Awesome. Well, that was fast. Okay. Well, let's get started. This is trauma-informed response for the justice system. And yeah, that's not going to work. All right. So let's get started. A quick little ditty, if you will, about me is I'm a retired sex crimes detective from the West Valley City Police Department in Utah. It's an active suburb of Salt Lake City. So I worked for 15 years on the job. I did 8 years in patrol in an extremely active city, and then 7 years in the Special Victims Unit, where over that amount of time I was assigned roughly about 1,200 cases. And so the trauma-informed victim interview that we'll be showing you today was co-written with Donna Kelly, who's a prosecutor and had been a prosecutor in the special victims field for about 20 some odd years. Actually still is. And this study was, this protocol was also studied. So a couple other things. I did some board of directors stuff and things like that. So we're going to get started. First off, let's get started with this. What is trauma-informed? Trauma-informed, certainly in our industry and in our profession these days, is certainly a buzzword. Everybody's talking about trauma-informed this, trauma-informed that. But a lot of times it depends on the lens that you're looking through. So on one side is treatment and assessment, and that is super based into the neurobiology of trauma. And then you also have a side with protocols, systems, and policies and organizational issues, and trying to make them more trauma informed. There's also trauma aware, there's all that sort of stuff. And so the process that we're going to share today has elements of both of those different columns, if you will, but it's structured more for the justice system and more for the masses. So we're going to start here. And what I want you to be able to see, and this is going to last a couple minutes. First off, relax. If you feel like laughing, laugh. But what I want you to see is this moment, and I like to call it the BAM moment. And it's when an encounter goes from consensual to not consensual. And you will see the brain react in a bunch of different ways. But you might see somebody pause just for a microsecond and then react to the threat, which is the snowman. And then the brain will catch on and go, holy moly, it's a snowman. It's not going to kill me. And we're going to go into this, but I want to show you, it's going to be about 20 examples. So it's going to go fairly fast. Is it going? Here we go. So hopefully you are able to see these reactions of people. And it's a reaction that if you have kiddos at home or anything else, this has happened to you, whether your kid is jumping out from behind a corner or you get startled with something. This moment, you can't control your reaction right then until your brain kicks in. And so let's start here with the guilt. So guilt for me came when this finally sunk in. When this bam moment happens and the brain is recording memories, can do it in a bunch of different ways that are very counterintuitive, which I didn't recognize. I know that in the past, when I was in patrol, I have booked a victim into jail from a domestic violence. I didn't see the reactions and what she was describing to me. I didn't understand it. I didn't know what I didn't know. But certainly looking back, I have guilt from that moment. I also have guilt for my first couple of years investigating sex crimes and adult survivors of sexual assault. A lot of times I closed out those cases like crazy, left and right, because I didn't know what I didn't know. And there was so many inconsistencies in people's experiences when they were talking to me that I closed them out. And certainly there's some guilt there as well. So let's get right to this. Here's been the problem. Victims have a wide range of behaviors. Some of them are bizarre, and a lot of them aren't appropriate for the situation. These behaviors have been interpreted as lying and inconsistent, but can be a result of trauma. So bizarre and not appropriate. I can remember going in for a sexual assault investigation, and my survivor is at the emergency room, and I'd go in, and right before I'd knock on the door of the exam room, I would hear laughing inside. Well, that was my survivor. Why is she laughing? She was just raped. That doesn't make sense. And so they were very inappropriate. So Dr. Campbell, among others, like Russell Strand or a Dr. Hopper or a Dr. Wilson and people like that, Dr. Lesak, have all been doing a lot of work in this area and doing studies. Dr. Campbell's studies have been very out there. So they've been in the media, they've been in the NIJ, and they've done a lot of great things. And she has noticed a whole bunch of what some of our issues have been in law enforcement. So I'm going to play this video. It's going to go a little bit longer than maybe the last one, but it has some great points that I want you to hear, and we're going to go back to these.
I got interested in this issue because I've done a lot of research with law enforcement, and we've talked about how when victims come in to give their report, what they say doesn't seem to make sense to me. It's suspicious. They don't quite believe what the victim's saying. They don't believe the way the victim's acting. And I was sort of curious about that as a psychologist. Well, the victim's behavior makes total sense to me. Why doesn't it make total sense to law enforcement? So this presentation is about taking what we know from psychology and about neurobiology and how victims are, and trying to bring that to the criminal justice system so that they can understand why victims are acting the way they do. So that we actually start off the entire interaction and their
All right. We are working on some volume issues here. And maybe this is not going to happen for us. I'm still not getting a good volume on it. All right, I think I'm just going to go ahead and skip through that. And hopefully the next one's going to be louder. I've turned up most of my controls here. So let's see what we can do. Hopefully in the future, it's going to be a little bit louder than that one. Or maybe I'll just narrate and I'll read lips. Okay, so let's get back to Dr. Campbell's research. So she's done a bunch of different studies, but this one that I'm going to bring from some quotes and stuff from is from a National Institute of Justice study that was done over a 12-year period that she looked back through police reports over 6 metropolitan jurisdictions. And so she would pull things out and she would interview officers, and they would tell her that things didn't make sense to them. They were sketchy. And so, with that sketchiness, they were interpreting it as lying because the stuff didn't make any sense. And it clicked on her that this was the trauma. So she found this. So she went out and talked to a bunch of officers. The stuff they say makes no sense. So no, I don't always believe them. And yeah, I let them know that. And then they'd say, never mind, I don't want to do this. All right, fine. Noted in the report, complainant refused to cooperate. Case closed. These cases traditionally have been extremely easy to close out. And I did this. I didn't know. This is how I was trained. I didn't realize what I had been doing. A lot of times I would go, hey, you sure you really want to go ahead with this? Or I would say, you know, that doesn't make any sense. And yeah, I would tell them, this isn't making any sense to me. Let's go over this again. Let's go over this again. And that was triggering the trauma even more so they couldn't get back to those memories. And then I would, a lot of times I'd even give them tasks to go do something to get back with me. And if they didn't by a certain time, I would close it out. And that was happening over and over again. And then things like this. The stuff they said makes no sense. They can't get their story straight. I see them hedge, making it up as they go. No way it's true. No one would act that way if it was true. They lie all the time, I can tell. Well, here's how this happens, a lot of it. And so if there's any officers out in the internet world here, they will understand this, but I also want to describe this for other people in the multidisciplinary team. So when we're in our field training, we are assigned different field training officers during our, what we call FTO, but it's the field training. And this person is supposed to go out and show us the job after the police academy. And usually you would get assigned to one of the most senior officers on the shift, usually graveyard shift on the weekends. And they were usually pretty grumpy and they were very hard to keep happy. And they were putting a lot of stress on us. And maybe we might be going through a Walmart parking lot, if you will, around 2 o'clock in the morning. And maybe we might see this guy on a bicycle without a headlight, right? And in my city, that headlight was reason to pull them over. It was against city code. And he says, you know, that guy on the bike, what do you notice about him? And I would try to guess things. And we go, well, he's not going into the Walmart. He's not going out. He's going across the parking lot. And he's kind of taking a gander into cars. Also, if he's an adult at 2 o'clock in the morning riding a bicycle, more likely than not, he doesn't have a car. And if he doesn't have a car and he's an adult, maybe he's been pulled over and had his license taken away. There's a good chance that if he's had his license taken away, he hasn't been able to afford his fines either. More likely than not, he probably has warrants. And so you would stop them for the headlight violation, and you start talking to them. Where'd you come from? Where are you staying these days? That sort of thing. And they would start hedging, and they couldn't get their story straight of what they were doing and why they were out and why they weren't going into the Walmart. Why weren't they leaving the Walmart? Were they already in the Walmart? That sort of thing. And eventually I would catch them in a lie, and I'd put handcuffs on them and book them into the bucket. At the end of the night, that grumpy old dude would pat you on the back and say, hey, good job today. And so we started recognizing these sort of things that were happening with our suspects. And it would get pounded into our brain that that's what lying looked like. Well, actually, in some cases it can be. But if your brain's triggered, a lot of times that could be the trauma. And we've been missing that. So if you're part of the MDT world, maybe that is you wake up in the middle of the night, 1 o'clock in the morning, and you go in for that last piece of chocolate cake, and it's gone. There's just some crumbs. Makes you really upset. In the morning, you question your spouse. Did you eat that last piece of cake? I tried to get it last night. No, I didn't do it. Well, you have one other person. Maybe you have one child at home. That's the only other suspect. So you know they took that chocolate cake, and you go and you talk to them. And maybe that child starts to lie to you and making things up, and you catch them in that lie because you can tell. Well, that enforces this whole thing with all of us. So let's talk about the advocates. It's hard trying to change what they do to victims. They don't believe them. And then victims give up. It happens over and over again. Certainly frustrating our advocates, our victims. He didn't believe me, and he treated me badly. Didn't surprise me when he said there wasn't anything that could go on, but it still hurt. So we were doing a lot of needless damage to our victims. So this presentation is going to talk about the victim side and why that's important. Certainly, it's the right thing to do to be victim-centric. But those of us in the justice system have been fairly good at doing the suspect side of an investigation. We have been missing a ton of evidence on the victim side of the equation, if you will. We need to do a victim investigation, and we need to do a suspect side of the investigation so that we're balanced. So let's get started on the fun stuff. Let's go back. The story starts eons ago. Certainly, depending on where you're at, let's just start with the caveman era. But our brains evolved over time. And I don't want to argue the evolution stuff, but a lot of our brain back then was what they'll call reptilian or prehistoric brain. Either way, it was developed to do one thing, and that's to make sure that we are alive and we survive, and that we pass our genes on and continue. And so as time grew on, other parts of our brains evolved. So we may be hunters and gatherers, but we might be hunted by a saber-toothed tiger, so we need to be ready for that. So we're going to get into the brain a little bit, okay? And we can start here. We can start with brain science and go through all these little things. But here's the thing. I am not a neuroscientist. I'm a cop. I like 4-letter words and bright colors. So, oh, heck no, we're not going to do that. We're going to get into this very simple like. And if you want to continue digging through, there's a lot of material out there and a lot of other trainings as well that you can go through. But really, for the justice system, we chose this profession because we didn't want to be neuroscientists. So we just want to focus on a few different key elements that we didn't know. And so we're going to go through those two. And we're going to start here with the prefrontal cortex when it's functioning, okay? This is right around the front end of the brain. And this was our last part of the brain to develop and to evolve. And this gives us special things and special traits that other animals don't have. This helps us be rational. We can reason with each other. We have a perceived control. Right now, you are in control of what is happening, but it's perceived. Because at any moment, what if an elephant came crashing through that wall right next to you and scared you crazy, right? You don't have control at that point. There's a freaking elephant in your office. So right now you have a perceived control. And you can have thoughts and behaviors that aren't just simply based on habits and reflexes. Reflexes, right? We kind of saw some of those with the snowman. And this focuses our attention. So whether you're paying attention to the screen right now or the other work that's on your desk, I've been on enough webinars in my time. I know that I tried to multitask at my desk. So it focuses our attention, like what you're doing right now. So this we can call the rational brain, thinking brain, that sort of thing. And now let's get into some of the defense circuitry, also known as the trauma response. And this does nothing but try to keep us alive. We call it circuitry in the brain, all these electrical impulses and so on and so forth. However, it's not like a computer. Our brains can learn, and these neural pathways can learn. And this is actually very important to a couple counterintuitive sort of responses from our survivors that I know in law enforcement frustrate us to death. So this is why people respond the way they do. So let's go to Africa for a second and look at some of these responses in animals. Let's start off with these impalas. And they're at the watering hole, which they know is dangerous, right? Because that's where the predators wait for them to come get a drink of water. And so we can see in this picture, 4 impalas down the bottom left, and they're taking a drink. And they're looking up and around, but they're pretty hypervigilant. They know they're in a bad place. And then look at the other impalas. They're looking around. They're acting as a lookout. All right? And then maybe this happens. Boom! And an alligator comes out after them. And just think, if you see what that impala just off to the right, or left side just off to the right, is all the way up in the air. What's going through their brain right now? Well, holy crap, right? In police work, I'll say it, that's the oh shit brain. And that's what's going through the impala's head right now, right? It would for me. Well, right in this time frame, we like to call that the BAM moment. I like to call it the BAM moment. And your brain is hyper encoding right now. So let's go back and take a look. And then boom. So let's look at it again. Now, next time the impalas come up to the watering hole, what happens if they see a bubble right in front of their face? Well, they're going to have a reaction, right? Because all the brain wants is them to survive this encounter. If they were to think about it, what if that impala right there had to think about it for a second and go, big teeth. I wonder if I'm going to get killed. They're gone. They're done. So it's an automatic response. But if they came back next time and that bubble comes up, they may react the same way. And so what that frustrates us in police work is if a survivor discloses they have been sexually assaulted before. Oh no, right? And we have thought to ourselves in the past, why didn't you yell? Why didn't you scream? You knew what was going to happen to you. Well, that neural pathway is built. And last time when you froze or you jumped or you had this other reaction and you survived, the brain just cares about surviving. So I will open it up to if there's any questions, you can send those in at any point. And I'll get moving on in just a second if there's any. All right. So a lot of this leading up to this BAM moment, if you will. Let's talk about polite resisting. Because in the justice system, there's a lot of times where we will recognize this or we will see this or hear this from our victims, and our cases could get declined. As a society, we are polite individuals, or at least we should be. We say thank you. Our parents would tell us to thank that person, or be polite and not rude, and that sort of thing. So a lot of times we are going to have some sort of polite resistance, but it's a warning that something's going to happen. Your spidey sense, if you will, is starting to go. So you might see things like this. Victims might say things like, I have to leave soon. And those of us investigating or talking will go, well, they didn't say no. They said, I have to leave soon. Well, actually, that's no. And we have not seen that. Or a lot of times we have not been able to interpret that statement. Maybe it's my boyfriend or husband will be mad. Well, she didn't say no. My roommate is home, or your roommate is home. They may hear us. Again, that's not NO coming out. It's polite resisting. This is a hint of things to come. And that our victim, our survivor, our client was starting to get that feeling, that hinky feeling. Submit and negotiate. This is another one that starts to, at least for those of us in the past that have been doing these types of investigations, this is something that has played havoc with our cases. I'll give you this if you don't do that. Well, she consented to this act. She just didn't want to do this one. Submit and negotiate. And we'll show a video, hopefully, maybe later, that shows some of that. Maybe not. So let's do this later. Don't hurt me. I'll do this at another time or another place. Well, that's counterintuitive. She said that she'd actually do it, just not here. Nah, submit, negotiate, it's a polite resisting. That's no. So let's take a look here. Let's take a look at these hunters, if you will, these cats, and kind of put ourselves as cavemen or whatever in this scenario. And they're kind of stalking that bird. But what if the saber-toothed tiger comes? Right? Let's watch that again, just because it's fun. So again, the predator comes up and they react. Right? If that was a real predator and they just kind of looked behind, they would be dead. They are already reacting. And at that BAM moment, their brains start a different type of memory, if you will, in a lot of cases. So it's kind of a domino effect. So that bam moment happens and your brain starts making these decisions and this domino effect sort of happens. So the defense circuitry, it's extremely important to understand. And this can kick in during a sexual assault, a physical assault, a threat, attack, other dangers, car crashes, armed robberies. This can happen during all of that. So our brains, our defense circuitry is continually scanning the environment for threats to our existence and behind our perceived control, right? And it's always on the lookout for threats. And when it detects an attack, it will kick in. And it can vary from a split second to a few seconds, and it'll take over. So it's a lot like a smoke detector. It's always monitoring, and then when it senses danger, it goes off. So during this, we may go out in our investigation and talk to perpetrators, we'll talk to victims, and this is where a lot of issues happen, especially for me out in the field. Before we get here, is there any other questions yet? All right, we'll get going then. So our perpetrators are going to have tunnel vision as well. So they are focused on what they want to happen, whether it's a sexual assault, whether it's an armed robbery. And they're really focused on that. Our victim is terrified and overwhelmed of what's happening to her. The suspect is focused. Their defense circuitry is in control. The thinking is planned and systematic. So a lot of times our perpetrators, let's say during an alcohol facilitated sexual assault, may go to 20 parties and only react once because they've been planning and thinking through it through their minds, and will react when the situation is right for them. Their focus is involuntary. It's on danger, it's on threats, it's on survival. All the brain cares about is surviving. And what is the threat that's going to kill me? So certainly we have like in a 7-Eleven, and they focus on the gun because that's the threat to their existence at that time. Maybe it's a forearm. Our perpetrator has a perceived control of behaviors and actions. Certainly it's perceived, kind of like that elephant. But what if at a certain point things go awry? That's not part of their planning. So the victims, their behavior is controlled by emotions and reflexes. The perpetrator's actions, their memories are orderly and the narrative is chronological. Our victims, their memories are fragmented and illogical and not chronological. So this is where a lot of this behavior that I've misread in the past comes out, and it doesn't make sense. So let's go into flashbulb memories. At that bam moment, if you will, a flashbulb memory is a vivid memory of an emotionally arousing event. So whether it's the snowman that heads turned, maybe it's the alligator that comes out. It's a vivid memory. This gets your defense circuitry involved. And this is why you remember these events more clearly than others. So maybe you've been in a car accident before, and that moment when you were sideswiped is right there, vivid in your memory right now. And it is more like a picture than a moving event. Bam moment, right there. So that flashbulb memory is extremely well encoded in your brain. So the effects on memory. So it's poorly remembered. What's poorly remembered is the sequence of events, the contents and consolidation of event, the events and details outside the perceived threat, right? So if you were a victim of an armed robbery and that gun's in your face, what color was this person's shoes? Well, the only thing that's going to kill me is the gun. It's not the shoes. And a lot of times we will focus on those peripheral details, and that frustrates us because the brain doesn't remember that. Not normally. What's well remembered are the details most important to survival. So that gun, maybe it's a forearm, that sort of thing. That is what's well remembered and well encoded. Because like the Impalas, if this were to happen again and you survive this event, you need to know that, how that happened. So a lot of times it's called a threat of harm. We call that in the law enforcement field a weapon focus. So when somebody jumps out of a car with a handgun or exposes a handgun during an argument, we have a weapon focus. What's also well remembered are the emotions on how it felt at this point and the sensations. Maybe you might have a feeling, a skin or a pant touch, right? There's different fabrics and sensations. The emotions, when that happened, how did you feel? I felt like I was going to die. Well, if you felt like you were going to die, more likely than not, this bad moment occurred. And so we're going to want to ask questions around that feeling and that picture at that time. So a lot like a weapon focus, like that gun. Any questions so far? I haven't seen anything pop up on the chat. All right, well, let's get to critical incident amnesia. So we study police officers a lot, especially in this day and age with the officer-involved shootings, right? So the brain does not have an infinite capacity to observe, so it narrows down the focus and ignores the rest. So a lot like what you might be doing at your desk right now. You might be concentrating on one thing and trying to listen with the other, but you're in and out of focus. Or you're watching this right now, but not paying attention to what's happening to the side of you. So it's focusing on really just one thing at a time. So we can either see the forest or the tree, but not both at the same time. So if you've never been to Force Science Institute, they study officer-involved shootings and what happens to the brain and the stress that happens at that point in time, which is that bam moment. And that's what happens in our survivors. So the perpetrator's account, when we're talking to them, it might be an order like that, 1, 2, 3, 4. And it makes sense. Once upon a time, right? So once upon a time to happily ever after. And so we understand that. We were raised with golden books. Once upon a time, happily ever after. When we go out to do police reports, we arrived on scene, we did this investigation, and we booked the suspect in jail. Or when someone comes home from work and you say, tell me about your day, they start at the beginning to the end because that's what makes sense to us. But our victims, they may have islands of memory. And those islands of memory, some can be big, some can be small. They're not in any order, they're just around. And what we hope to do is to fill some of those areas or get more insight to those areas of memory. Maybe it looks like a wall of sticky notes, and maybe those pink sticky notes are the sexual assault that occurred. We need to find our way through those and gather as much information as possible. And then our skills as the investigators or the interpreters come into play. So officer-involved shooting research. So again, we have studied officers like crazy in these type of situations. So let's take a look at this, critical incident amnesia. It's a temporary amnesia that will affect the officer's memory and their ability to write a detailed report. And so if they go home and they sleep, after the first sleep cycle, the memory increases. That time between those islands, if you will, can increase up to 50%. After a second sleep cycle, it may increase up to around 90%. There's a lot of the memory that's going to be gone and not able to get, that's just gone. So this is why a lot of our officer-involved shooting protocols are the way that they are. And if you went to the International Association of Chiefs of Police and their officer-involved shooting protocols, you're going to see this sort of thing. We will go out and do a public safety statement and see, we have to do that. And we'll talk to the officer and make sure they're safe. And then maybe we have somebody who's down and deceased. So we will ask the officer if that person was the threat. Yes. We want to know if there's more than one, because we only have one person deceased. And were there any other suspects? Where are those suspects? We have to look out for public safety. So we may ask those questions. And then we're going to want to know which direction those bullets went, or which area that this officer was trying to shoot. We need to do that to account for every single round that has gone through that gun, because it may have gone through a wall and hit an innocent bystander, and we need to get them the services that they need as well. And then at that point, we cease the investigation, and the officer goes home for a few days to rest and to get more of those detailed memories back. That's why the sleep cycles. This is very frustrating to our citizens who want and deserve a lot of the answers right now. However, our officers aren't able to recall everything that's happened. So that's why they go home. And then we redo an interview. We have not been doing this with our survivors. And then the ability to write a detailed report. Those of us in law enforcement, when we've gone to a traumatic event or a car crash and we give witnesses a witness statement, how many lines are you getting? 3 or 4, right? You're not getting a whole account of what happened because they're not able to. So let's talk about some responses of the body. So what happens to our body when this bam moment happens? We've talked a little bit about the brain and some of the memory stuff. Let's talk about some of the body stuff. So we've heard playing possum, and we've heard about a deer in the headlights. Why is that? Well, let's take a look at this really quick. Let's show you a video. Where's this? So there might not be much volume again. She's saying that it was frozen in the road for nearly a half an hour, and the officer comes by and picks up the deer to take it out of the roadway. It had been there for 30 minutes, frozen in the headlights. Then watch this. All of a sudden, it's off, right? It turns off. So it was frozen, then in a snap, boom, can trot off into the bushes. So it's a quick offset. This happens to human beings all the time as well. And that frozen can be for a few seconds, a minute, sometimes 30 minutes, right? So think about this. I always had an issue with this, and that was, well, how did point A to get to point B? Because that would have been difficult in this area, especially if our survivor didn't want this to happen to them. Well, if your survivor went into tonic like that deer, could you get the pants off that deer? Think about that for a second. Let's talk about flight. So what happens first is this freeze, and your brain decides which way the dominoes are going to go a lot of the time. And so if you're not able to flee and the danger is there, the perceived threat is there, maybe our survivor is 4'10" and our suspect 6'4", and they feel like they can't flee. They may go right into that tonic immobility or collapsed immobility. If they feel or they're going to try to flee, they're going to do so. But our brain reacts so fast. And so I want to show this video. This is going to show a lot of the brain in action, not just the flight, but it's going to show this domino effect and this decision that happens without us even thinking. There is no volume on this one. Wowza, right? So right here, if you would have thought more than what's going to happen, the kiddos would have been dead. Didn't have that chance. The brain processed and went boom without the rational thinking. And then we also have fight. So we've heard fight or flight, but there's the freeze, flight and fight and faint. There's a lot of different reactions. So let's talk about the fight for a second. And this one really doesn't have any narrative as well. It has a little bit of sound, but nothing that you really need to see. So we'll get back to the snowman. Let's watch this. The brain detects the threat, right? And boom, and he's fleeing away from the threat. Doesn't know what that threat is. And certainly our little kiddo there had no idea. But he was getting away from the threat. Now, if his brain, or if we're attacked and we jump backwards and we fight and then go back, because maybe the person that is attacking me, I'm a larger man, and this person attacks me, I might fight and flee and then go, oh, wait a second, I can take them in a split second. We've seen the brain work so fast. And then I might engage in the fight. So now we're going to do this one. We want to show fighting from fear, but this one, I'll give the disclaimer. There's certainly some words and stuff that flop up what's happening, but there is fake blood in this one. And so I'm going to describe what happens so that you're not also triggered. However, so we have a guy that is under the hood of the car fixing his car, and then we have his friend who is a prankster. And you can see where he's down on the ground right now. But in a second, you're going to see him standing up over the wood pile, and he's going to have a chainsaw. And so his buddy's just thinking that he's sawing wood. His buddy then puts down a chainsaw that actually has the blade on it and picks up one without, puts it to their chest, and pops a blood pack. So you'll see some blood there, and then lays down, and you'll see the reaction. So there he is, chopping wood. And then he gets the other one without a blade and lays down. And watch this, boom. Goes into collapsed immobility, which is different than the tonic immobility. And so right now, would you be able to get point A to point B? Yes. But look at, they're not snapping out of it like that deer. The deer snapped out of it. The collapsed immobility has a longer offset, if you will. And so now if you're interviewing somebody, they might have bits and pieces of memory that aren't there. Okay? And then if that threat is still there, they may go back into the collapsed immobility. So you're going to have bits and pieces of memories, and some of them not in order. So talking about the freeze, the threat's detected, the options are weighed, and then the superencoding begins around that threat so that you'll recognize it in the future, right? So like when we're talking about the watering hole. And if there's no other options, you will stay in that spot. So you might have a dissociation experience. And this is the brain's method of protecting you from overwhelming sensations and emotions. You know, some people, if you've talked to them and they've cut off their finger before, I didn't feel it until later. Well, the brain disassociated so you didn't have to feel that. Think about the saber-toothed tiger. Do you want to remember or feel the pain when you're being eaten? No, you don't. So you might feel disconnected. You might say, I felt like I was in the corner watching. I went to another place. I was just spaced out. But here's a big thing. Look over here at number 3. Autopilot kicks in. That's been very counterintuitive to those of us in law enforcement and in the system. Because we might hear that they started this sexual act and continued until the act was done. We might hear that our survivor was actually in a sexually dominant position. Maybe they were on top of their attacker in that sort of position, which is a dominant position. However, autopilot will kick in so that you can get done with this horrific situation faster. And so you might hear about those sort of things. It can be explained. So playing possum, when a possum goes into tonic immobility, they do emit somewhat of a smell, but they might be looser and not frozen solid. This is for a lot of evolutionary responses. A lot of times the predators, like a coyote, need some of the struggle from their meal, if you will, to continue with that feed response. So tonic immobility. And its purpose, again, is to preserve life. So it's a perceived inability to escape. So perceived. We may be thinking that our survivor could have gotten out of this situation, but their brain, their reality, their perception is their reality. If they don't feel like they can escape, then they will go into one of these responses. It follows a failed struggle or a fight or to escape. And it's usually sudden onset. So you might have a pronounced verbal or physical immobility, collapsed like we just saw. It can last for minutes or hours. So it's caused by an extreme fear. So this minutes or hours, that can frustrate those of us in law enforcement. Well, what do you mean she just laid there? What do you mean there was other guys lining up outside the bedroom door if it was a frat party or something like that? Well, it can last for minutes or hours. And here's the other one, is pronounced verbal and physical immobility. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. We've all heard that before. We might be thinking, well, there was 10 people in the other room and she was sexually assaulted in a bathroom right next to that. Why didn't she scream or yell? She couldn't. It wasn't her choice. It was the brain's choice. Humans, we've been using tonic immobility a ton over our existence. We're going to show you one right here on where they're shearing sheep. And he is going to twist the head of the sheep and it will go into tonic immobility so it doesn't struggle while he's taking the wool off. And then you can shear the sheep without it struggling. However, what went through that sheep's mind to get it into the tonic immobility? Did it think it was going to get sheared? Or did it think that somebody was going to rip that freaking head off? Well, it's the latter. Its head was going to be ripped off. And it went into tonic immobility. So we've been using that as well. So our victim might say, hey, I was frozen. I felt numb. My legs wouldn't move. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. So I just kind of went limp. You will hear those. Those are hints around that BAM moment that we want to get the detail from. And to get that detail, we want to talk on what is well remembered by our victims. And if you remember back in the responses, emotions and sensations are what we want. So tonic immobility, there was a study back in 2008. 44% of people had an immobility event when they had a close call with death. The greatest of those, however, were 60% were with sexual assault. So if we have that BAM moment, or we're getting descriptions of tonic immobility, 60%. So then we have the collapse immobility, like the guy underneath the hood of the car. So it's a sudden onset, but a more gradual. So it's a physiological cause. The heart gets a massive input, right? And drops and blood pressure drops. But they might be describing, you know, I felt woozy. It was like somebody put something in my drink, right? You're just thinking about that right now. In my 1,200 cases, I sent a lot of blood to the lab because of people describing this. I didn't get any date rape drugs. It doesn't mean that they weren't there. They didn't get found. However, there's a good chance that it could have been this. Loss of muscle tone. So it can go back and forth. That's important because our victims might have stayed and slept after the rape. Well, if they stayed at the house after the rape, then it really wasn't, she didn't have a fear for her life. She wasn't afraid of him. Not necessarily. It could be the collapsed immobility. They may have rolled over and gone to sleep. This is caused by fear. So officer-involved shooting research, again. When they've talked to officers, they've had all these different responses. And certainly sharing experiences, a lot of our officers, if not most, or all of our officers have had this happen to them once or twice or more. but also those of us in the multidisciplinary team, think about different times maybe you were in a car crash or something happened to you, and take a look at these. So I don't see any questions, but please ask them if you have them. I'm going to share a quick story here or two. So years ago, it's been about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, I was at work early in the morning, 8 o'clock. I mean, I'd get there early. If you can't tell, I have ADHD. I'm better in the morning. And so there was a couple of other officers on the detective floor. Third floor was detectives, second floor patrol, first floor courts, and the lobby, and a stairwell that emptied out into the lobby. Well, we hear this scream on the radio, this yell, and those of us on the job have heard that before, and it's of extreme panic. And the officer in the lobby yells, "Gunman lobby." And I remember my buddy poking his head up over the top of the cubicle and goes, "What the hell?" And at that point, we are running. And we're running towards the stairwell on the other side of the floor, because that's what we do. We run towards that danger in this field. I hit the stairwell, and into the stairwell I go. I have no idea when my gun came out of the holster, but it was in front of me. I remember one thought of, uh-oh, I don't have a vest on, and going down the stairwell. Luckily enough, there was 2 sergeants that were still, patrol sergeants that were still on their floor, and they spilled out in front of us. And when we got down to the bottom of the stairwell, I remember the sergeant kicking the door, looking out, bringing his head back in, and laying down gunfire. For me, I was part of that 17% where it shows intensified sound. That was louder than hell for me. After that, I have a few other pictures, but most of it is around this feeling. At that point, the stairwell had filled up with officers pushing. And I remember me being pushed into the lobby and thinking, oh no, here it goes. But I looked down and there was a body on the floor, and we had a whole wall of windows. And from the percussion of the sound waves, it shook the ceiling tiles. And there was dust coming through, like light through the rays of light. I remember jumping over the body and going out into the parking lot to see if there was a second shooter. It was kind of on autopilot at that point. And a threat, and spill out to see if there's any more. So it happens to us in all sorts of different ways. Maybe it's car crashes. I can talk about those at some point as well. But we're going to move on from here unless there's a question. All right. So I want to look at this for a second. This is a case that I had where a lady was in town to attend a training and fill out paperwork for her job with a propane company. Her personnel, it was stationed in my city, and so were some other people from around the state and the Intermountain West. They do their paperwork for 2 days, and then at the end of the second day, they decide to go out and have some drinks. They weren't driving. There was 2 bars within the area of parking lots. And she goes and she drinks. And she has about 5 drinks over 4 hours worth of time. And then they go back to she goes, at that point, I don't remember much of what happened. And then our patrol gets a call at 4 o'clock in the morning that there's a naked woman walking through the hotel that looks disoriented. So go out and they find her. She starts to get some things back, believes that one of the other coworkers raped her. From her perspective, she was raped. And honestly, I believe as well. And when the officers talked to the suspect, he said, well, you know, she said she was going to sleep with somebody, so it might as well be me. She doesn't have any recollection of that conversation. She just knows that she was raped. And so she went for a sexual assault exam. Well, she was from a different state and no support except for the victim advocate from the Rape Recovery Center that came out and the sexual assault nurse, both of which were awesome during this event. But she started to post on Facebook. I checked her Facebook history. She wasn't one of those types of friends that throws a lot of drama out there, if you will, but she didn't have any support. So here she writes, my awake Facebook friends, I was pretty sure I was raped last night. Please help. I'm surrounded by Utah cops that believe this was my fault. I don't know what to do. Please help me. There's no female police in Utah. So we see these statements that are kind of all over the place. They're short and they're brief, and some things are capitalized, some things are not, and it's kind of all over the place. This is right when, about an hour and a half after the assault took place. At the hospital, Officer X won't tell me his first name. Then this, out of the hospital, her exam was about 4.5 hours long. Out of the hospital, still under the influence, right? My flight home was at 6. The hotel gave her a full day so that she could sleep some more. And it ended up being about 6 hours worth of sleep. Now she's at the airport. And she goes through here, spent 45 minutes with Detective Y. Well, she worked out of state, or she lived out of state, so I wasn't sure if I could wait the whole couple days of wait time. So you got to do what you got to do. Maybe not all Utah police are worthless. Well, obviously they haven't talked to my wife. Anyway, so then she starts talking some more, right? And then she goes home and she sleeps, and then bam, right? So she talks about what happened to her, and then she even says things like this: between the act itself and my inability to think or remember what happened, our survivors and victims have been telling our officers and us for eons about what happened to them and been documenting it. We've been missing that evidence. Now, if we're interviewing our survivors during that time and not after a few sleep cycles, how much information are we getting? Right? We've been missing it. And so you get this a lot. Aren't cops and prosecutors supposed to be objective and independent and not victim-centered? Well, look at these. We certainly have these for children, and they are victim-centered. But just like child abuse cases, where we are interviewing our victims to their ability, we have not been doing that for our victims that have had their brains triggered and have had trauma. We have been interviewing not to their ability. So talking about the trauma-informed victim interview for the justice system, let's simply look at this. Our suspect's brain and our victim's brain, certainly like on domestic violence calls, or maybe this is when they get picked up for the date, they're communicating with each other. Both have different brains, but they are communicating similarly. Then that bam moment happens, whether it was the alligator, right, or a forearm, but that bam moment happens. And now our suspect's brain is the same as it was. Our victim's brain and where the memories are at communicates differently. It speaks a different language. And then we have this: the suspect and the police talk about the same sort of stuff and communicate from the same area of the brain. Then this, the justice system, the police are talking with their rational brain, our victim is not. We have not been speaking the same language. So there's a key to speaking that language, and we're going to share that right now. First off, we want to start with the dynamics. And when you look at this picture, we want to do the opposite of what we've been doing for the suspects. Suspects have been getting interviewed in a room with maybe a metal table and a light from the ceiling. We've been doing similar with our victims. Now here is a soft interview room. This was set up for a news shoot. I probably would not sit on the same sofa as a survivor to interview them. There was a chair off to the side. But aesthetics, our brains are threat mapping. They are looking around for all sorts of threats. This is why our children's justice centers, one of the reasons why they have a softer room to talk to their survivors, is so that they don't feel these threats. Also, why you should not be in a uniform or a soft uniform when you're interviewing children. It's the same sort of thing. It's very intimidating, and in some cases will re-trigger our survivors depending on their past experiences with police officers. So you want something soft and comfortable, certainly private and safe. This attitude, empathetic eyes, empowering and giving choice. So do you want to sit on this side of the sofa or this side? Certainly that's a small, tiny question that doesn't have anything to do with your case, but it has everything to do with giving power and choice to our victims so that they feel comfortable accessing that area of the brain and talking to you. Open posture, right? The same sort of thing. They are reading their brain subconsciously. That threat detector, the smoke detector, is constantly reading. And so that helps bring down those threat responses. Active listening, nodding, right? And talking through things like that. You want to have soft, empathetic eyes, like those eyes up above. So the easiest way to do that is to relax those eye muscles. And once those eye muscles relax, the rest of your body will follow. You can still be very tactical minded and relax those eye muscles. So you want to have soft eyes like Keanu. You're laughing, I know. Any questions so far? I don't see anything popping up on my screen. So when we're talking and doing our investigations, our suspects will give us the timeline. This has frustrated us. Don't worry about it with your survivor. We know that they, for the most part, aren't able to give you the chronology of events, but our suspects can, and you can match your victim's experience to your suspects. So our victims are going to give us the visceral. How did it feel? How did you feel at that point? What was the texture like? What did it smell like? That's what's well encoded in the brain. So we are going to ask questions around there. So we're looking for that bam moment. So that moment happens in most, not necessarily all, but most sexual assault cases. We saw like 60% with tonic immobility alone. So if this has happened in a sexual assault, this does not happen during consensual sex. That's huge. Their perception is their reality. If you see this, or you see that weapon focus, they talk about the freeze, that sort of thing, it doesn't happen during consensual sex. So from their brain, their perception is their reality. They were raped. They were assaulted. This event happened to them. Now we need to do our investigation. So it happens when a normal expected experience goes to the unexpected. That weapon focus also doesn't happen during consensual sex. And so maybe they might tell you they were raped at 2:36 in the morning. That's an extremely accurate event. It's very well encoded. And so maybe you have them describe that picture that's in their head. And if you're able to go to a crime scene, you may be able to corroborate most of what's in that picture that they're describing from that angle. What doesn't work is this: the who, what, when, where, why. But that's what we need. We need that for our police reports. We just need to go get that information with the victims through a side door. If you use any confrontation, this could easily hit the trauma response again and shut them down. Rapid fire questions do that. I certainly use rapid fire questions a lot in the field, trying to get to the other calls that we're holding. And this, again, can start this domino effect, and you won't get much information. Polygraph and voice stress analysis, we do not do on victims of crime. You may lose your federal grant dollars. So we want these interviews to look more like kid forensic interviews. They have a lot of the identical goals. We want to get a narrative. We want our victim to feel heard, to talk in these narrative forms. Then it's our skill as the investigators in the justice system to pick out those gold nuggets. So these aren't very spooky. Yes.
Justin, we did have one question.
Awesome.
That I wanted to pose here. It's in regards to the interview where it's held. So Angie asked, Justin, what are your thoughts on using alternative locations for victim interviews that they choose, like their home or a third-party location rather than a police interview room, whether it's soft or not?
Interesting. So that's a great question, honestly, and I have not had that one before. So for me, I always, and I can in Utah, other places around the country like in Massachusetts may not prefer this to happen, but we do videotape or tape record our interview process so that the emotions and is there and it's well preserved, and their experience is well preserved, because the defense might look at it and tap out. So if you were able to say, well, if you did have a soft interview room, certainly I would prefer it there. However, we want our victims to have that power and control that was taken away from them. So if they really wanted to do that here, I would be okay with it. I would ask if I could use my digital recorder to record the interview so it can be transcribed and put into the evidence. I don't have an issue with that as long as they were safe and it was a place where they would not be interrupted during this process. So that's a great question. I haven't had that one yet. But I would also take a look at your local jurisdictions, or at least the district attorney's office. The cops, believe it or not, are usually more adept and can change momentum either direction. Sometimes it's our district attorneys that may have a harder time with that. So this helps keep our survivors, our victims, our clients involved to the end of the case, because they've been treated a lot better than what we have been doing. And the detail helps improve our cases. So when it comes to first responders, when it comes to the guys out in the field, if it's a domestic violence sort of sexual assault or a domestic violence case, they should at least try their best to do what they can in a trauma-informed and a trauma-aware sort of way. Because we know that a lot of our domestic violence victims may not participate in the rest of the investigation. And so we would want them to do that. But if it was something different, then we would want them to get probable cause only, which would be kind of like a public safety statement. The what happens, the who did this, the where it happened. Now, we just ask the who, what, when, where. Why? Well, these are not trauma-informed questions, but these are some of the questions that we need to get answered. So if we're able to get these through the feelings and the emotion questions, then that's what we need to do. But this also helps get a case opened. And we want to think peripheral details. Peripheral details will fade fast. So if an armed robber had a smiley face on their sweatshirt and it was a dark one, our victim might remember that smiley face on the sweatshirt now, but may not necessarily remember that in 3 or 4 days when we interview them with more detail. So we want to think peripheral. And then we ask about the central details, concentrating on the visceral. So what that means is what may have caused the bam moment. Maybe it's the forearm, right? And then the detail will get more in the follow-up interview. So this is a guideline. It's meant to be fluid in nature. And at the end, in just a couple more slides, I will give you my email address. I'm happy to send this out. It's a guideline. It's fluid in nature. So it's meant to have some of the art of the interview there. So every victim in every case is different. And so we go through introductions. We do this with our kids' cases. And I'm happy to send out, like I said, this protocol. So it sets the tone. We want them to see the relaxed eyes, the empathetic eyes. I explain the purpose of the interview is to gather as much information about their experience. Now, is that directly trauma-informed? This is not a therapeutic interview. This is a trauma-aware, informed sort of interview for the justice system. And the justice system is not trauma-informed at all. So we want to hope we will get this. I explain the interview will be recorded, but that certainly will vary from state to state. And the importance of giving all the information. That directly wouldn't count as, quote, trauma-informed. However, we do need that for the justice system. And so I thank them for being there. The always tell the truth is also something that may not be all the way in the neurobiology. It's more about being aware. However, always tell the truth and don't guess, because we realize that there may be gaps in your memory and we can explain those. So don't make anything up. Just go ahead and just tell me what's up. And then sometimes victims are embarrassed or feel like they've done something wrong or feel responsible what happened. We want them to feel comfortable to tell us, but we also want to tell them why it's important, because sometimes things may pop up in a cross-examination that might surprise us, and we don't want that to happen. So what you say is important. Again, I tell them we're recording. We do have support people, if at all possible, especially if it's a victim advocate. Now, this can vary from state to state, especially with confidentiality and so on and so forth. Here in Utah, where this was developed, and in the city that was developed, we had a systems advocate, and they can be subpoenaed, but we try to keep them away from that. But we want to build that relationship with advocacy, because they are so important to our cases. So the rules were basically not to ask any questions or give any input. Once somebody else starts questioning in this interview, they are acting as part of the investigation and can be subpoenaed. So we try to keep that away from our victim advocates if at all possible, and to remain silent. However, if they see that my victim needs to tap out and needs a rest, they can tell me and we'll do that. So we have about a few more slides. I know we're getting close to the time. But please, if there's any questions, type them out and we'll get that going. So we attend to the victim's priorities. I let them know that with trauma-informed victim interviews, if we used to do 30 minutes, you're gonna do an hour and a half. And if they need to pick up their kiddos at 3:30 in the afternoon and it's 3 o'clock, they're not gonna feel relaxed enough to get to that area of the brain. And then if they have any questions before they start. So we use this line. It's very familiar to the FETI. This is not the FETI. This is more geared towards the masses than what the FETI is designed for. So it can be all sorts of different ways when it can be said. This one happens to say, help me understand everything you're able to about what happened. FETI has a line like about your experience. And so you can go back and forth, but a general line like this, and then I'm quiet. And if they need to be started in a narrative, I might say, well, talk about everything that happened around when he picked you up. Tell me everything you're able to about what happened. All right? And then we don't interrupt. So this is really hard, especially for me. But this huge narrative will come out, and I might jot down a few different ideas, maybe around that BAM moment. If she talks about something like that, maybe she starts talking about, they start talking about being frozen or certain things like that. I might jot that down on the back of that guideline. And then after they're done, I'll let them know that I'm going to ask follow-up questions on some of those areas because I may want to get more information from there. Also, if I'm going to ask a hard question, I explain why, because sometimes these need to be asked so they don't pop up. You know, tell me more about using heroin, that sort of thing. We don't want that heroin usage to come out on the stand, right? I'd much rather that happen in a more aware sort of environment. And so then I will ask those questions around those moments. And then give them some support. Certainly, we want to stop the damage we've been doing. And this sort of investigation and interview process will help save them hundreds of hours of professional support in the future. I do thank them for what they've done so far. I encourage them on surviving and healing the best that they can, and I will take care of the case. I explain the next steps. They'll more likely than not forget that. And then I don't make promises about the outcomes. It is the criminal justice system, not the victim justice system, unfortunately. But I'm going to do my best. And then this is how you contact me or the victim advocate. If you're lucky enough to have a victim advocate involved in your case, those of you in law enforcement, I usually give that card and say, hey, if you have any questions, let your victim advocate know. And if they're not able to answer them, go ahead, shoot me an email. It's the best way to contact me. My phone's not usually, I don't usually answer my phone, but I do email. And then if the victim advocate's not able to answer a question, they certainly talk cop talk, and maybe they might talk to me, but they might also say, yeah, I can explain what a preliminary hearing is, or that sort of thing. But there's such a great team member having that advocate involved in your case, whether it's a community or as systems. So we want to interview looking for that little BAM moment. What does that little BAM moment look like? What does it feel like? That's what we want to get described. That is the hint And that's what we're digging for. That's what we're looking for. That consent portion, and then we can deal with the other stuff. So the study in West Valley City is just finished up for a second time, which I've heard is sustainable, which is great. Around the country, we are prosecuting, in most cases, single digits of what is actually going to the prosecutor. So our first study did this. We were prosecuting about 6% of the cases, and we ended up at, without training the district attorney's office, we ended up at about 24% prosecution rate. 400% improvement? Heck yeah. However, if we're to look at this realistically, if we were prosecuting 6% or even 24% of the homicides that are happening in this country, our public would have us. We're not going to prosecute 100% of these cases, but we can certainly do even much better than 24%. And so here's some contact information, and I'm happy to send out this webinar. It'll also be archived, and they'll talk about that in a quick second. If you want a copy of the protocol, I'm more than happy to send that out as well. Or if you have any other questions, let me know. You're welcome to use my phone, but just like back when I was interviewing survivors, sometimes I can look at those messages forever, and it might be easier to send me an email. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it back on over to SVJI.
Sure. Thank you, Justin.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. Great. So thank you, everybody, for attending today. Please be on the lookout for more training opportunities from Justin for the remainder of the year. And JJ and I's contact information is in the chat function. So if you'd like to reach out to us, certainly feel free to do so. But we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And again, thank you for attending. So
thanks for the time, guys.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and we'll end the meeting now. So thank you.
Take care.